Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything like this, usually the case when I speak to a group like you. I kind of learned this from George Wallace, who was a racist son of a bitch. But George Wallace could read an audience better than anybody I've ever seen in my life. George Wallace would walk to the lectern with a speech carefully prepared over weeks in advance by speechwriters who were paid glorious sums of money. But he would absorb the chemistry and the dynamics of his audience and change the whole thing and speak mostly extemporaneously. Another man who could do that was Colin Powell. In fact, I really felt for him when he was constrained as Secretary of State, to a certain extent as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but he got away with a lot more there. But when you're the first cabinet officer of the United States government, you don't want the words you speak to appear above the fold, front page, right side of the Washington Post or the New York Times unless they're circumspect, sagacious, and ambiguous. You don't want them being declarative. And so I really felt for him as he had to give these speeches as Secretary of State, and he had to stick to the text. And sometimes he would divert from it, and almost every time he would pay for it. It's a hard life. But I read a little chemistry here tonight, and I decided, one, I got a hard act to follow. From Okinawa to Iraq Veterans Against the War, who are now all Veterans Against War, and so forth and so on, you guys are really something, and gals. And I thought about the book I just finished reading, Devil's Bargain, by Joshua Green, Bloomberg News. In the back of that book, as I'm wont to do in any book I read, I immediately wrote my impressions on the last page, which happened to be conveniently blank, and I said, this is bullshit. There's very little analysis in this book and a whole lot of recounting of events. And if you look at the notes, you'll see that the events are those that are reported by the mainstream media, basically, including Bloomberg, including Joshua Green. But that's what we do in America today. We just recount events. We don't do investigative reporting. We don't do thorough analysis because we don't want to. We're too scared when we do that, too frightened by what we find out. It's much easier to just increase the ratings by reporting on Kim Kardashian's butt or by reporting on the tweeter-in-chief or some other equally puerile and stupid thing. But I did think about something that Joshua Green says in his book as I listened to what was happening here tonight. And I'm sure what happens all across the country, and now, as I was just informed by Barry, in Japan, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and so forth, and that is populism. Because Green attributes Trump's meteoric rise, if you will, to populism. Well, hell, you're populist. Your message is a whole lot more popular to peace than theirs. I don't understand this. If Trump's victory was due to American populism, where are you? And where are all the other people in the United States and around the globe who grow daily in numbers? If you saw that anti-Iraq war march in the UK, you know they are growing in numbers. Why aren't they more effective? Why don't you counter the people who put Trump in the White House? Why doesn't your populism trump their populism? Especially since we've seen what their populism leads to in places like Charlottesville just in the last 48 hours. And Trump can make all the counter statements and appeasing statements and, oh, I've got to do this and I've got to do that statements all day long. It's his fault. There's no denying it's his fault. When you use the bully pulpit of the United States to advocate white racism, xenophobic nationalism, and hate, and, hey, Mr. Policeman, why don't you just smack that guy instead of moving his head into the car without hurting it, then you're telling people you have permission to do that. Your populism is sick. So I want to hear someone tonight tell me, we'll go out in the corridor or we'll go get a drink afterwards. I don't have to leave till 9:30 tomorrow. I want to know why we don't beat the hell out of them. Is it management? Is it organization? Is it efficiency? Is it dedication? Is it speaking eloquence? What is it? Money. Okay. Media. Okay. See, I'm getting answers. And yet, when I read about Robert Mercer, who was the guy who really bankrolled Steve Bannon and his daughter Rebecca, who must be a witch, and I read about their plans and their strategy and so forth, even in as poor an analytical effort as Joshua Green's book is, and I've supplemented that with some other people whose analysis was a little better. I can't understand why we can't marshal the people who are opposed to them, not necessarily because they're on our side, but because they're opposed to them. And they will gladly donate their millions.
Too busy fighting each other.
Well, that's part of it, but why can't we capture some of that? Why can't we capture some of this money? And not just George Soros, who sometimes I think is guilty of playing both sides against the middle, but some of the real money that's out there that's capturable. And we can talk about this afterwards if you want to, because I know some of it that is. This is fresh thought. These aren't prepared remarks. Fresh thought brought on by what I heard as you deliberated before I came up here. We need to get better. And we need to attract more money. And we need to fight these bastards to the death. Because let me tell you, I'm not saying this because I want to ideologically or otherwise defeat these people. I'm saying it because I think, and now I'm into my remarks, there are three futures ahead of this country right now. And every day that goes by, as I live cheek and jowl with the Beltway, so to speak, we get closer to one of these futures. One is dismemberment. People say, my students will say to me, what do you mean? Why would California, the fifth largest economy in the world, and the predictions right now for Brexit in the UK are that California will surpass the UK in GDP within the next 24 months, and that's probably going to be the case. California could break off from this country tomorrow and be better off. My students say, wait, professor, that could never happen. And I say, read a little history. Do you understand that one of the most powerful currents in human history is state or monarchical failure and collapse and border change? Where do you see sacrosanct borders in the world? Oh, don't talk to me about 100 years. Talk to me about 500 years or 1,000 or 2,000. Or the whole 5,000 years of recorded human history. States do not last. Countries do not last. Territories, empires do not last. They disappear. Where is it written and granted anywhere that the American empire is forever? It isn't, and it isn't. So dismemberment is one of the potential futures I see, and I no longer see it in the distant future, but in perhaps my children and grandchildren's lifetime. And that's out to about 2070, maybe past that if they're lucky. Texas could go easily. Easily. A student at Iowa State University recently, when I was kind of pontificating this way, raised his hand in the back, and I recognized him, and he said, now, you just said that the Electoral College is a vestige of slavery and ought to be eliminated. How then would Wyoming ever have the representation that California brings to Washington? 2 senators and 2 senators, 400,000 in Wyoming and 30 plus million in California. And I said, it shouldn't. And he said, well, then we'd fall apart. I said, bingo. But if I were a businessman, if I were a corporate leader, not an idiot like Donald Trump, a real estate casino magnate, but a real businessman, an American businessman who cared, like, for example, the guy that I read about on Delta today who started Delta Airlines and who was a quintessential businessman who thought that the most important thing in his business was his employees and his customers. My God, that's an anachronism. But if I were a real businessman, like this guy who founded Delta, I would say to Wyoming, get thee into California because you're stupid sitting there by yourself. Any businessman would do that. It's an idiot situation to have Mississippi and Alabama basket cases who don't just not contribute to the U.S. GDP, but through revenue sharing, drain it every year from California and New York, who contribute together about $200 billion to our GDP. And oh, by the way, $90 billion of the defense budget is spent in California, so they'd have their own army. It would make a lot of sense to do that. But we won't do that because we're too stupid. We think our Constitution is sacrosanct. It is not a pact for suicide. We should have had a constitutional convention 20 years ago. That's the second potential outcome. Not dismemberment, but really getting our act together, having a constitutional convention, or at a minimum, a new process like that of 1947, which created the National Security Act and the National Security Council, the Unified Armed Forces, and the CIA, and so forth, sitting down and actually thinking about the way we govern ourselves and changing it dramatically. More democracy, not less. And some really fine tuning of something called national security. One of the reasons we have a $1.2 trillion, yes, I said it, defense budget every year is because we have it all spread out in fiefdoms in the Congress. We have our nuclear weapons and energy. We have our Veterans Administration cost in VA. We have our intelligence budget spread over an entire 17-entity intelligence community, and believe me, it's over $100 billion a year now. 85% of that is owned by the Secretary of Defense. People look at me when I tell them that the NSA is a Defense Department entity. They go, no, it can't be. They're spying on us. It can't be a military. Oh, yes, it's a military entity. The NSA is a military entity. State's 150 account, pittance though it is, all of these things add up to $1.2 trillion a year, not the $600 billion, which is outlandish in itself that the Pentagon gets. We need to have one single committee. I would prefer it to be a joint committee, call it the National Security Committee or whatever you want, that looks at that all the time and says to all that aggregated amount of money, you're too much, and begins to cut it. And to cut it wisely, not stupidly like sequestration and budget caps, which are just an admission of cowardice on the part of your members of Congress. So that's the second possible outcome if we keep on this path, is that we move into a really rigorous look at the institutional fabric of our governance. That includes elections and how we do them. And we come out on the other end after a couple of years of deliberation with 3/4 of the country having approved those deliberations, and we have a whole better process. Now, the third outcome, which I think has a 90% chance of being reality, is we keep slip sliding into hell. Let me say that again. We keep slip sliding into hell. Why do I say that as the most likely? There's a theory of international relations called conservation of enemies. Very simply stated, it maintains, very wisely I think, that no state should have any more enemies at any one time than it can handle. Donald Trump, and I swear to God, H.R. McMaster, Jim Mattis, and John Kelly haven't heard of this maxim. We are now looking at, someone said it already, at the bottom of the list, Venezuela, if you will. I mean, if I want to prioritize by power. But at the top of the list, we've got Russia, China, Iran, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. My God, we couldn't handle two of those at the same time, let alone all of them. And this president seems to think he's going to take them all on. Now, here's the Washington wisdom. Now, you know what he's doing? He's doing just what he did with Steve Wynn when he was trying to keep Steve Wynn out of Atlantic City and the casino world there. And what he's done in every deal he's ever conducted in his life, he's trying to use bluster and bravado to achieve a higher position so when he goes into negotiations, he's got a lot of leverage. Do you know what that sounds like to somebody like me who's experienced in presidential decision making? It sounds like a recipe for hell. It sounds like a recipe for maybe 2 or 3 of those enemies simultaneously. It sounds like a recipe for some of those enemies like Xi Jinping in Beijing and Putin in Moscow saying, oh, bring it on, because while you're doing all this crap, we're going to gain so much ground on you, you will be sick at what we've achieved when you're finished with your chaos. I would love to be Xi Jinping in Beijing watching the empire implode. What is China doing right now in Southwest Asia, for example? Do you know they just ran a diesel train from Shanghai to Iran? Took about 29 hours. They're going to reduce that by 2/3 because they're going to build high-speed rail into Iran. They're also refurbishing Chabahar and Bandar Abbas, 2 of the prominent ports on the Iranian southern coast. They don't give a good God dang about Donald Trump finding Iran in noncompliance. In fact, they probably would like for that to happen because then that does not isolate Iran, it isolates the United States vis-a-vis its principal allies in Europe and certainly vis-a-vis its 2 potential enemies in China and Russia. They will be laughing all the way to the vodka and the sake. It's incredible what we're doing. Incredible. China has built a corridor across Pakistan. That corridor starts in Kashmir. Guess what Kashmir is? A nuclear exchange potential between Pakistan and India, Pakistan being one of the most dangerously destabilized nuclear states in the world today. In 2002, Colin Powell and George W. Bush, to his credit, had to get General Musharraf, then President Musharraf in Islamabad, on the telephone, and his counterpart, foreign minister and president in Delhi, and say, we're coming over, you guys sit down and take it easy for a minute. Because they were getting ready to have a nuclear exchange. When we got there and we talked to Musharraf, who was a smart man, a general, president of Pakistan at the time, by a coup, of course, but that's a Pakistani predilection. We said, what are you going to do as your initial move? Well, we'll shoot 20 weapons. What do you think they're going to do? Well, they'll shoot 20 back. These are nuclear weapons, mind you. Well, what do you think is going to happen then? Well, we haven't thought about it. Let us share with you some 4 decades of real deep academic and political thought about nuclear weapons. And we did. And we calmed them down. And we also did some other things that were very important. We talked them into permissive action locks for their nuclear weapons, which means you actually have to go in and unlock them before you can use them. We talked them into things like de-escalation strategy thought and escalation strategy thought and so forth. We got them to think about the road they would be going down once they started a nuclear exchange. And so we've had not too much trouble since then. But right now, because of the Chinese having done what they've done in Kashmir, and Pakistan being, in Delhi particularly noted, a Chinese ally, the Indians see that as a sort of fait accompli in determining the fate of who owns Kashmir, which, if you know anything about that region, you know has been a real tinderbox for a long time. So here we are, and the Chinese and the Indians also near Bhutan on their northern eastern border are 100 meters apart with artillery and weapons and so forth and so on, getting ready to start a war with one another. Has Donald Trump said anything about that? Has the media said anything about that? Really, I looked through the New York Times the other day from A section to the end, couldn't find a word about it. All of this is happening at a time when we have the most amateurish team I have ever seen, and that's a compliment, in my life in the White House. It's staggering to see where we are, so you just see a little bit of why I say slip sliding into hell is probably the future. Will we slip slide in a way that is so dramatic to a majority of the American people that they then take note, abuse themselves of some of their ignorance and apathy, and suddenly say, wow, this is bad, we need to do something, in time to actually do something? And then what will that something be? Will it be impeachment? Will it be an impeachment of the vice president too? Because my estimation is it ain't much better. And then we get Paul Ryan. Oh. Or do we need to really take some dramatic, concentrated, and positive populist action? And does the first thing we need to do kind of resonate with, I think it's your first objective, and that is do something about the war instrument. Do something about the fact that this state lives for war. How many Americans, and I can tell you because I've been in all 50 states, I do a little analysis of every audience, and I ask these questions, even know that since 9/11, their nation has been at war. I tell them, come to Washington and you will see it. You will see it dramatically demonstrated because your soldiers and Marines are still in battle dress. I didn't think I would live long enough to see my nation put its soldiers in the shopping centers, malls, metros, taxis, and everywhere for 17 straight years in battle dress. But that's what's happening. We got on the metro the other day out to National Airport, my wife and me, and she said, why are those people in BDUs? I said, you need to ask. We're at war. We're a nation at war. And yet the nation does not know we're at war. It doesn't. It simply doesn't. The all-volunteer force is falling apart physically, morally, and ethically, and the nation thinks it's fine and it's all right that it do all the bleeding and dying for the rest of them. This is an incredible situation for us to be in. One that not a single one, I would contend that not a single one of our founders, not Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts or Ben Franklin from Pennsylvania or Thomas Jefferson from Virginia or Madison Monroe, any of them would have ever envisioned. But let me read you some words of, I think, a great American who wrestled with this, said that I think eloquently described it a half century earlier. Many of you probably will know these words, but they don't hurt repeating. They're not the words that everybody associates with Dwight Eisenhower. Those words are usually the military-industrial complex, the sort of metaphor that he surrounded that with. when he was walking out of office in January 1961. This is 1953. This is 1953 in the American Society of Newspaper Editors, and the Cold War is in full swing. McCarthy's in full swing with the red baiting and the communists and so forth. The train goes all the way across America, called the Freedom Train, damning communism and Karl Marx and everything else and making a whistle stop in city after city. A mayor in Missouri actually calls a weekend Communism Weekend and commits his entire town to being in prison, literally, for that weekend so he can demonstrate to them what living under the Red Menace might mean. And Eisenhower says, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, and those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 people. It is 2 fine, fully equipped modern hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the threatening cloud of war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. This is a 5-star general who also said, I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can. That's why I feel an affinity with all of you. That's why I feel an affinity with my veterans at William & Mary. That's why I feel an affinity with everyone who's ever been engaged in this horrible evil that man created that's called war. I wear this pin on my lapel, and people ask me questions about it all the time because it's not my Vietnam unit. It's not anything to do with me, really. It's the 612th Tank Destroyer Battalion from World War II. Men from Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, who trained together for 9 months at then Camp Hood, Texas, and then deployed together right after D-Day, and went with Patton's Third Army from the breakout at Avranches all the way to Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, across the Rhine, and the end of the war. I have never met men who were closer to one another. Their life experience, whether they wound up being an investment banker making millions of dollars or a plumber barely surviving, their life experience was World War II and that unit and those men. It's the tightest group of veterans I've ever been amongst. For 20 years, I went to their reunions, and for 20 years, I kind of said to them, you give me your pin, I'll wear it everywhere I go, and maybe I'll turn over your cup for you when you're all gone. That's becoming a reality faster than I thought it would. I just hope I live long enough to do it. What a group of people. And in that sense, I have an affinity with every veteran on the face of this earth. Those at William & Mary now are extraordinary young men and women, and I'm really stunned at how many of them are women now. You know, one of the problems with the all-volunteer force is we can't find enough men. So it's not egalitarian, not really. I'm glad to see it happening, but it's not egalitarian, it's because we can't find the men. In the Army, we've gone to 2 to 22% women. And I would dare say we'll probably be at 50% in another 20 years with the trends that are now occurring because they're volunteering, they're recruitable far more so than men. That's another statement on I'll say it, the depravity of the ethics of less than 1% of America bleeding and dying for the other 99%. That is unconscionable. It is reprehensible. But no one out there really finds it that way because it's very comfortable. It's very comfortable. I recently had a conversation with Dennis Leach, Major General, U.S. Army Reserve, 35 years, wrote a book called Skin in the Game. And you can tell from the title what he's talking about, Skin in the Game. And he says in there, just imagine if we had a $1,000 war tax on every household in America, or we had every household vulnerable to the draft if we would have 17 years of war. Of course we wouldn't. The war tax alone would probably do it, because it would force Americans to realize what we're doing. And I would submit to you, and this is back to your effectiveness as a populist movement, or any movement for that matter, that 51% at least of 330 million Americans probably at root agree with you. Either for the monetary reason, or I'd hope for the ethical reason. We do not need to be a war state. There is no contract anywhere with anyone that says America has to be a war state. Now, there are contracts with Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and a host of others that say that. I had a reporter ask me one time, why do you say that about Lockheed Martin? I said, well, you know, when I was Chief of Staff at the State Department, I was sitting there one day and I said, I've divested myself of any shares in anybody that even looks like a defense contractor, but I want to look at my financial disclosure form and I want to see just what was there and what's going to happen after we go to war in Iraq. And the first one I looked at was Lockheed Martin. I had a lot of military colleagues who were working for Lockheed Martin, and they talked me into buying a few hundred shares of Lockheed Martin stock, but I divested myself of it when I became Chief of Staff at the State Department, as I did all my other stock. But I'm looking at it and I'm saying, well, I think I'll just track this. $26.75 a share. We invaded Iraq. 9 months later, it was $118. Do I need to say anything else? If war is that profitable, you're going to have more of it. And you're going to have people who get money back from that, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, whomever, going into John McCain, going into Chuck Schumer, going into whomever. They don't care whether they're Democrat or Republican or independent. They're going to give money and they're going to get something for it. I love these people in Washington. The one thing DeVos has done, you know, DeVos at education, the one thing she's done is say categorically, yes, when I give money, I expect a return. You know, at least she's honest in that regard. But I listen to these people tell me they're not influenced, and I say, watch TV, Senator. Watch TV, Congressman. You watch, you know, $8 billion, $16 billion, $24 billion on an advertising account, and TV doesn't influence anybody? Why do they spend that money then? And you're telling me you're accepting 100,000 here, 200,000 there, 300,000 here, and so forth, and you're not influenced? Give me a break. You think I was born yesterday? Of course it's influencing them. So that's another thing we need to do. Citizens United ranks right in there with Dred Scott. You know? Maybe the idiots on the Supreme Court had a point if labor unions were still as powerful as they once were and contributed in a way that balanced the billionaires, and government regulation was so stringent as it was after FDR got through with the people who brought on the Great Depression, as it was then. Those two things, government regulation carefully implemented and labor unions, check the predatory aspects of capitalism. That's the only way capitalism can exist. Capitalism's goal